So, here's a question for you. Do we actually get more ethical as we get older? I mean, are we born with our moral compass set in stone, or is it something that changes with experience? Well, we're going to dive into that very question by looking at a really fascinating study that focused on retail professionals.
And it's no wonder people are so interested in this. Think about it. From these massive, world-shaking scandals, like Madoff and Enron, all the way down to the small, everyday choices we have to make at the office, ethics are everywhere. They're a huge deal. And this study wanted to cut through all that noise, get past the headlines, and see if there were any real patterns.
Yeah, so it really comes down to that classic nature versus nurture debate, but for our professional lives. Are our ethics just baked in from the start, or are they something we build along the way? To get some answers, researchers went out and studied over 600 people working in the retail industry.
Now, this whole study is built on a really cool idea called moral development. The big takeaway from this theory is that our ethical code isn't just something we're born with. Nope, it's something that's learned and can actually change over our lifetime. It's kind of like a muscle. It suggests we can literally grow our ability to think and act morally, just like we would with any other skill.
Okay, so if our ethics can actually grow, then what helps them grow? Well, the first thing these researchers looked at was pretty simple: age. You know that old saying, older and wiser? Does it actually hold true when it comes to being ethical?
Well, if you look at the research that was already out there, there's no easy answer. In fact, it's kind of all over the place. Experts are totally split. On one side, you've got a ton of studies that say, yep, as people get older, their ethical decision-making gets better. But then, on the other side, you have just as many studies that found no connection at all. It was a real toss-up.
So with the experts completely divided, the big question is, what did this study find? For these 600-plus retail workers, did getting older actually make a difference?
And the results? Wow, they were pretty clear. The study used something called a personal business ethics score, let's call it a PBS, to measure everyone's moral judgment. And what they found was that the group aged 26 and older scored almost 3 full points higher, on average, than their younger coworkers. That's a pretty noticeable difference.
And listen, that difference wasn't just a random fluke. The researchers confirmed it was statistically significant, which is just a fancy way of saying it's a real, meaningful pattern. So for this group of retail workers at least, that old, older, and wiser saying, it really held up. Age was definitely linked to a higher ethical score.
All right, next up, let's talk about management experience. Does getting into a position of power, where you're making those tough calls, sharpen your moral compass? Or does power corrupt?
And guess what? Just like with age, the experts are split on this one too. On one hand, it just seems to make sense, right? If you're dealing with complicated situations as a manager, your ethical reasoning should get better. But then again, plenty of other studies looked at professionals and found nothing, no positive connection whatsoever.
So what about our retail workers? Well, the data showed a pretty clear picture here too. Managers with 5 or more years of experience scored noticeably higher on that ethics test than the employees who had 0 management experience.
And once again, this wasn't just a small bump. It was another statistically significant result. So for this group, having years of management under their belt was strongly tied to higher moral maturity. It looks like for them, power didn't corrupt. It might have actually made their ethical thinking sharper.
Okay, so we've looked at age and we've looked at experience. It's time for the final piece of the puzzle: formal education. Does going to college and getting a degree actually make you a more ethical professional?
Now this is where the debate gets really interesting. You have a lot of researchers who will tell you that education is the single strongest predictor of how ethically mature someone is. But then, you guessed it, other studies, specifically looking at managers, found absolutely no connection between their education level and their moral development. 0.
So when we look at the results from this study, at first glance, the pattern seems to continue. The folks with 4 or more years of college did score a bit higher than those without a degree. But if you look closely, that gap is way smaller than the ones we saw for age and experience. And here's the big twist. Even though the scores were a little higher, the difference was so small that the researchers couldn't say for sure it was a real effect. In statistical terms, the result was not significant. It could have just been random chance.
And the researchers themselves were really careful to point this out. They mentioned that out of their whole sample of over 600 people, only 52 of them actually had college degrees. And with a group that small, you really can't draw any big, firm conclusions. So when it comes to education's impact, the jury is definitely still out.
All right, we've gone through all the clues this study gave us. Let's pull it all together now and look at the final verdict. What really shaped the ethics of these professionals?
So here it is, the final scorecard. Age and management experience, both were clear winners. They were statistically significant, linked to real measurable bumps in ethical scores. But education, well, it didn't quite make the cut. It didn't cross that statistical finish line, leaving its impact as a big open question.
I think the bottom line is actually pretty hopeful. It suggests our ethics aren't just fixed, they can actually develop and grow over time. And what's the secret ingredient? It seems to be real-world experience, the good old classroom of life. For this group, just getting older and gaining management experience were the two things that really moved the needle. The role of a formal education, though, that's still a bit of a mystery.
And that leaves us with one last big question to chew on. If experience is what really forges a stronger moral compass, then what's the responsibility of companies here? How can they, and how should they, be designing experiences that don't just create good managers, but create better, more ethical human beings? Definitely something to think about.